It was the unseen enemy that truly strangled an empire. For Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, the chilling reality of Japan's demise wasn't found in grand naval battles, but in the insidious, relentless disappearance of black gold. The year is 1941, and Japan, a nation of islands, pulses with a potent, expansionist ambition. But underneath this veneer of strength lies a profound, fatal vulnerability: oil. You see, the home islands possessed almost no petroleum of their own. Their industrial might, their burgeoning military, their grand design for a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, all of it depended utterly on a constant, unceasing flow of crude from distant lands. This wasn't merely a preference. It was an existential necessity, a thrumming addiction that fueled every tank, every plane, every warship in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Before the war, over 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States. When the United States and other Western powers imposed severe oil embargoes in 1940 and 1941, it was a declaration of economic war. Japan was faced with a stark choice: withdraw from China and the Pacific, or seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia. To a military-dominated government obsessed with national prestige and expansion, the decision was inevitable, if not suicidal. On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor ignited the Pacific War, an audacious gamble for vital resources. Admiral Ugaki, then Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was at the heart of this strategy. He understood the desperate gamble, the need to strike hard and fast, to create an impregnable defensive perimeter around the newly acquired, resource-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya. The plan was to secure the oil of Borneo, Sumatra, and Java, to fuel the war machine and sustain the fight against the colossal industrial might of the United States. For a time, it worked. The early months of the war saw a stunning string of Japanese victories: Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. One by one, these territories fell, their vast natural resources, especially oil, coming under Japanese control. Tankers, often repurposed merchant vessels, began the arduous, dangerous journey back to the home islands, laden with the precious cargo that kept the war effort alive. It felt like a triumph, a decisive answer to the embargoes, a testament to Japanese martial spirit and strategic brilliance. But this perceived victory was built on a foundation of sand, or more accurately, on a thin, vulnerable thread of shipping lanes stretching thousands of miles across the vast Pacific. Ugaki, with his analytical mind, might have harbored quiet concerns, but the early momentum was intoxicating. The problem wasn't just acquiring the oil, it was getting it home, safeguarding it across immense, hostile oceans. An empire fueled by stolen resources is an empire tethered by supply lines. And those lines, unseen beneath the waves, were already being targeted by an enemy Japan profoundly underestimated. The silent hunters of the United States Navy were just beginning their patient, methodical work, a grim harvest that would ultimately starve Japan's war machine. The illusion of self-sufficiency through conquest would soon shatter, revealing the true fragility of an empire that couldn't protect its own lifeblood. Admiral Ugaki, meticulously reviewing intelligence reports in late 1942, felt the first unsettling tremor beneath the surface of apparent Japanese strength. The early days of United States submarine warfare had been, frankly, less than impressive. American torpedoes, particularly the Mark 14, were notoriously unreliable, prone to running too deep, failing to detonate, or exploding prematurely. This initial ineptitude, however, bred a dangerous complacency within the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their own anti-submarine warfare tactics were rudimentary, and they often dismissed the American submarine threat as a nuisance, prioritizing the protection of warships over the seemingly less important merchant vessels. This was a critical miscalculation. While the large battleships and aircraft carriers received escorts, the slow, lumbering tankers and cargo ships, vital arteries of the Japanese Empire, were often left to fend for themselves. But beneath the waves, a transformation was taking place within the United States submarine force. Commanders like Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, recognizing the systemic flaws, pushed relentlessly for improvements. By 1943, after persistent efforts and grim trial and error, the faulty torpedoes were finally being replaced or modified. The submarines themselves were becoming more capable, their crews more experienced, and their tactics sharper. What began as a sporadic threat was evolving into a precision instrument of destruction. The immense distances of the Pacific became both a challenge and an opportunity. United States submarines began operating in critical chokepoints. The Luzon Strait, the East China Sea, the busy shipping lanes between Formosa and the Philippines, and the waters around the Dutch East Indies. These were the very corridors through which Japan's lifeblood, oil, iron ore, rubber, bauxite, and food, had to pass. Each sunken freighter, each flaming tanker, was a tiny chip in the massive edifice of Japanese power, but these chips, when accumulated, would ultimately bring the entire structure crashing down. You can almost feel the increasing tension in Ugaki's daily entries, the subtle shift from confidence to a creeping unease. He, more than many of his naval colleagues, had a keen grasp of logistics and the industrial realities of modern warfare. He understood that without raw materials, factories stood idle, and without fuel, the fleet was a collection of rusting hulks. The Imperial Japanese Navy, focused on decisive fleet actions, was blind to the true nature of the silent war being waged against its merchant marine. They believed that by defeating the United States Navy in a grand battle, the war would be won. They failed to grasp that the true battleground was the vast, empty ocean, where their merchant ships, one by one, were vanishing without a trace. The slow-motion strangulation was accelerating, becoming a palpable threat that would soon be impossible to ignore. Ugaki, observing the grim tally, knew that something fundamental was changing. The storm was gathering, not on the surface in a clash of steel, but deep beneath the waves, where a silent, relentless enemy was poised to sever the very veins of his nation. By early 1944, the whispers in Admiral Ugaki's war room had become a roar. The relentless, unseen attrition of United States submarines was no longer an inconvenience. It was a crisis, a slow-motion strangulation of the entire Japanese war machine. The Mark 14 torpedo, once a symbol of American mechanical failure, had been perfected, transformed into a deadly, reliable weapon. United States submarines, now operating in wolf packs and with increasing impunity, were carving a bloody swathe through Japanese shipping. The numbers were horrifying. Merchant shipping losses soared, not in tens or hundreds of thousands of tons, but in millions. From 1941 to 1945, Japanese merchant tonnage lost to submarines alone would total a staggering million tons out of an overall loss of million tons, accounting for over 60% of all shipping destroyed. Tankers were a primary target, each one a direct hit on Japan's jugular. The oil lifeline from the Dutch East Indies, so painstakingly secured, was being systematically severed. Ugaki, a man of meticulous records and keen strategic insight, saw the charts turn crimson with sunken vessels. He understood the exponential impact of these losses. It wasn't just the oil for the fleet. It was the fuel for factories, the rubber for aircraft tires, the iron ore for steel, the bauxite for aluminum. Without these fundamental resources, the entire industrial base of Japan began to seize up. The once proud Imperial Japanese Navy, designed for a decisive, glorious surface engagement, found itself immobile, anchored in port, not for lack of fighting spirit, but for lack of fuel. The remaining oil was hoarded, reserved for a last, desperate, climactic battle that would never truly materialize in the way the Japanese command envisioned. Submarines sank not just tankers, but troop transports, vital cargo ships carrying food and ammunition, and even naval escorts. The convoys that did attempt the perilous journey were often decimated. The once bustling ports of Singapore, Manila, and other conquered territories became graveyards of ships, unable to move, unable to deliver. The vast distances that Japan had initially sought to control now became an impossible burden, each mile a greater risk for any vessel daring to traverse the waters. The very concept of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, built on the promise of resource independence, was dissolving under the silent assault. The raw materials were there, in distant lands, but they were as unreachable as if they were on the moon. The United States submarine campaign was achieving what no surface fleet could, a complete economic blockade. The horror for Ugaki wasn't just the loss of ships, but the terrifying implications for Japan's ability to wage war, to even sustain its own population. He saw the grim future unfolding, a slow, agonizing death by starvation, not of people, but of the very industrial heart that pumped life into the empire. The silent, invisible enemy had found Japan's Achilles heel and was grinding it down to dust. The strategic implications were catastrophic, a reality that Ugaki recognized with chilling clarity. Without fuel, the mighty Imperial Japanese Navy, the pride of the nation, was increasingly confined to port. You can imagine the frustration, the desperate arguments within the high command. Grand plans for fleet movements, for decisive engagements, were scuttled or severely curtailed, not by direct enemy action against the warships themselves, but by the absence of the petroleum that made them move. This wasn't just about tactical victories, it was about the fundamental ability to project power. The same paralysis gripped the Imperial Japanese Army. Trucks, tanks, and other motorized equipment became static monuments to a forgotten era of mobility. Aircraft, once swarming the skies, found their hangars empty, their pilots grounded, not for lack of planes or pilots, but for want of aviation fuel. The trickle of oil that still made it through was prioritized for frontline units, leaving vast sections of the war machine sputtering and dying. Beyond the military, the blockade wreaked havoc on civilian life. Food imports, once a significant part of the Japanese diet, dwindled. Rations became meager, and the population, already facing immense hardship, experienced increasing hunger. Industrial production plummeted across the board. The machines that once churned out weaponry, munitions, and essential goods for both the military and the populace now stood silent, their gears locked by the absence of raw materials and energy. The relentless sinking of cargo ships meant that even domestically produced goods struggled to reach their destinations, fragmenting the national economy. Ugaki, a keen observer of cause and effect, understood that the submarines were not just sinking ships. They were sinking the very foundations of Japan's ability to resist. The island garrisons, scattered across the vast Pacific, were particularly vulnerable. Cut off from resupply, they faced slow starvation and dwindling ammunition, becoming ripe targets for the relentless United States island-hopping campaign. The fierce resistance put up by Japanese soldiers on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, while a testament to their unwavering spirit, was ultimately a desperate, localized struggle, unsupported by the comprehensive logistics a modern war requires. The United States submarine force, a relatively small percentage of the overall Allied military, had achieved an outsized strategic victory. They had bypassed the heavily fortified Japanese island chains and gone directly for the jugular, severing the economic lifelines that fed the entire empire. The silent blockade had proven to be as effective, if not more so, than any decisive fleet action. Ugaki, in his grim analysis, must have seen the war transforming from a contest of military might to a protracted, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts, all delivered by an unseen, underwater foe. The empire, though still defiant, was bleeding out, its strength ebbing with every lost tanker and cargo ship. The end was not a sudden, cataclysmic event, but a slow, agonizing slide into inevitable defeat, hastened by the silent, relentless pressure from below. The ultimate surrender of Japan in August of 1945 marked the official end of World War II. But for Admiral Matome Ugaki, the war had effectively been lost long before the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It had been lost in the vast, unforgiving waters of the Pacific, sunk piece by agonizing piece, by the silent, unrelenting attrition of United States submarines. His final diary entries, stark and unvarnished, reveal the depth of his despair and his ultimate understanding of this silent weapon. He had witnessed the slow, agonizing death of an empire, not through glorious battles, but through the insidious strangulation of its economic lifeblood. The very resources that Japan had gambled its future to acquire became its undoing, proving to be utterly useless when they could not be transported back to the home islands. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the iron ore of the Philippines. All were worthless treasures, locked behind an impenetrable barrier of American torpedoes. Ugaki, ever the dutiful officer, chose to embark on a final, symbolic kamikaze mission in an entirely futile gesture of defiance on August 15, 1945. the day of Japan's surrender. He died knowing that the vision of a self-sufficient, powerful Japan had collapsed, starved not by a lack of courage or skill, but by a fatal deficiency in strategic foresight regarding the vulnerability of its supply lines. The story of Japan's war machine is, at its core, a story of oil. Its acquisition was the catalyst for war, and its loss was the undeniable harbinger of defeat. The United States submarine campaign, often overshadowed by the more dramatic air and surface battles, was arguably the most decisive factor in the Pacific. It was a victory of patience, persistence, and industrial might over a geographically dispersed, resource-dependent empire. The silent blockade achieved its grim objective, crippling Japan's ability to wage war, to feed its people, and ultimately to sustain its dreams of empire. The ocean, once a highway for expansion, became a watery tomb for Japan's aspirations. The memory of the black gold, sinking to the seabed in shattered tankers, must have haunted Ugaki until his final moments, a chilling testament to the unseen enemy that truly won the war. The story of Admiral Matome Ugaki is a poignant reminder that in modern warfare, logistics and resources are often the most formidable weapons of all, capable of winning wars without firing a single shot on a battlefield, but rather by cutting the vital arteries of an entire nation. The silent blockade proved that an empire built on oil, without the means to protect its flow, is an empire destined to drown. What lesson do you take from this unseen battle for survival? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of history.